Alright, there's a lot of context to this game. So the original Metroid came out in 1986, with Metroid 4 Fusion coming out in 2002. That's a 16-year gap. From then to the release of Metroid Dread has been a 19-year gap. That's more than half the series' life and the majority of my life at this point. In that time, the Metroid series has seen a few games, and even fewer good games, but we didn't see Samus return to her 2D Metroidvania glory, which was always my particular favorite part of the franchise. In the past 10 years, indie gaming has seen an explosion, and along with it the Metroidvania genre has seen a great resurgence. Many Metroidvanias considered to be some of the greatest of all time come from this 10-year period. The genre is getting better at telling stories, it's getting better at developing worlds, and it's getting mechanically so sound that it's some of the greatest gameplay I've ever played before. It's even getting brave enough to experiment and fuse with other genres as well. In this absence, the Metroidvania genre has exploded, so Metroid Dread has a lot of expectations on its back, the weight of the Metroid series itself and the weight of the Metroidvania genre. So how does this game prove that the Metroid name deserves to be part of the genre? Well, Metroid Dread isn't doing all these crazy fusions and innovations in storytelling that we've seen over the past 10 years, and instead kind of strips back and shows us that this is what a Metroid game is all about. Much like Bloodstained Ritual of the Night felt like a retreading of Shadow of the Night with some of the new things from the newer Castlevanias, this felt like a Metroid game with some of the new things from Samus Returns. So starting the game up, the game starts with an intro cinematic, which is meant to give people who haven't played Metroid before a bit of context into what's going to happen in this game, and I guess has a bit of a recap for Metroid players like myself. But I played this game in front of people who hadn't played Metroid before, and they didn't really understand that that was 4 games worth of story. But really it's a bit of a minor issue and a bit of a nitpick from a lore master like myself, but it doesn't really matter because we need to get into the gameplay, which is some of the greatest Metroid gameplay I've experienced. I don't know what it was with the level design in this game, but it felt so amazingly smooth to play through it. Of course my Metroid intuition was at full gear, so I was doing really great as well, and I never ended up feeling lost at any point. I got through the game in about 5 hours with 70% items or so, which is one of my fastest completions on a first playthrough. In terms of movement mechanics and gameplay though, it did feel amazing. Samus's movement felt very responsive, and it was nuanced enough to have some pretty crazy tech for secrets. 360-degree aiming did feel amazing when shooting enemies, but I did have a bit of a problem with some of the controls. Some of the button combinations between switching beams and missiles and stuff felt a little bit weird, and I don't think they ever really settled into muscle memory. I feel like if I went back to the game after a few months of not playing, I would have to fiddle around for a bit before I actually got them down. I don't know, maybe I'm too old and I just miss the L and R simplicity of the SNES. The biggest and most controversial mechanic was definitely the parry, which carried over from Samus Returns. Against generic enemies, it was always the best method of killing them, and it ended up feeling a bit like a glorified QTE. It did feel pretty badass going down a hallway shooting things with missiles and then parrying somebody at the very end of the hallway, but I think it actually shone best during the boss fights. Parrying boss fights in the middle of that intensity made me feel like I was playing something like Fury or Sekiro with my pro parrying skills, and in that aspect I think it was definitely appropriately used. The gameplay does however have a weird grinding halt in the middle of it where you had to sit through about like 15 minutes of explanation from some bird. I'm somebody who loves the Metroid story, and I don't feel like an exposition dump was the way to tell the story in the game, but really the most problematic part about it to me isn't necessarily all the dialogue being said, and is instead how disconnected that section of the story seems to be from the greater overarching narrative being told. That bit of exposition seems to focus on the Emmys as enemies, which I don't necessarily agree with because I don't have many good things to say about the Emmys. I had initially likened them to the SAX because an enemy chasing after you is exactly what the SAX was, but where the SAX was scary because it was a threat to you, being a fully powered Samus, the Emmys only ever felt like an obstacle to get to the next section, especially given that all of them but one were killed using the same method. This could of course be the fact that I was a literal child when I played Metroid Fusion for the first time and have a much scarier association of the SAX than I do the Emmys now as a grown adult. Still, there's only minor hiccups because the majority of the game is actually going to be spent doing Metroid things, running around, shooting enemies, shooting at walls, getting lost. It really is a genuinely great time. And the ending of this game is probably my favorite ending to a Metroid game so far. In terms of gameplay, the boss was fun and challenging, and it really did push a lot of the gameplay mechanics I think I learned over the course of the game. And in terms of story, I think we got a little bit more story than I had anticipated, which is definitely a bonus for me. Overall, this definitely feels like a game worth picking up for Metroid fans and is a great entry into the Metroid series in general. If you've always wanted to play a Metroid game but are too scared of legal gray areas or the Nintendo ninjas, then this may well be the most accessible Metroid, and it's definitely a good one to start with. If you're a fan of the Metroidvanias in general, I think this is also a great game worth considering. It's mechanically one of my favorite Metroidvania games ever, and despite the lack of enemy variety or the bare bones story, any Metroid game with Samus as the main character is a plus for me. Except that one time.